welcome to Indie Series Spotlight. This is the show where I get to feature some of my favorite independent, creator-owned, and small press comic books in my collection. A lot of you who've been following the channel have been following me unpacking all of these oversized books, which are almost all Marvel books, because that was what I got started in collecting when I came back to comic books in 2010 to start collecting collected editions. But along the way, I really gained a great love of indie comics as well, which is not a huge surprise because even when I started collecting comics back in the 1990s, I very quickly drifted away from just reading Marvel and DC and read a whole range of independent comics, which at the time was a lot of Image Comics since that was new, but a lot of other different publishers too. So I'm here today to talk about, which is probably, if you took a vote from all three members of our household, our favorite comic book series. I'd feel remiss if we didn't cover it as soon as possible, and that series is Lumberjanes from Boom Entertainment, specifically their Boom Box sub-line of creator-owned series. So I am actually going to talk about this in two halves. That's how Indie Series Spotlight works. I'm going to talk about it in a more general way in the first half, so it's not going to give you major spoilers past the first few issues. And then I'm going to briefly pause, warn you that the spoilers are coming, and then go a little bit more in depth for the rest of the series. Okay? So Lumberjanes. What is Lumberjanes? Lumberjanes started its life as an 8-issue miniseries that quickly won fans and acclaim. And it is about a group of young girls who are at a summer camp. But it's not just any summer camp. This summer camp is, it seems like it's going to be an all-girls camp. It's called the Miss Quinzella Thisquin Pinnacle Thistle Crumpets Camp for Hardcore Lady Types. And, it seems like it's just going to kind of be a Girl Scout camp, but the girls very quickly discover, even in their first adventure, that there's something very different about their summer camp. It's full of strange mythological beasts that just happen to be waiting in the wings, waiting in the edge of the forest to harass them and make their summer a little bit strange. And we are focused on one particular camp cabin that includes 5 young girls and frequently their counselor, and then also the camp director. So these girls get involved in trying to basically escape these crazy monsters, foxes in the forest, river monsters, for the first few issues. And it starts to emerge that all of these monsters are part of a larger plot that the camp is embroiled in, along with its brother camp across the way, which is a very kind of traditional Boy Scouty camp that doesn't seem to think they're encountering a lot of these creatures, but really they are. So part of the magic of this series is not just the concept of it, but it is the cast. So this cast of characters, they're of a number of different ages, which kind of makes it weird to understand like why they're all in the same cabin. Most camps I worked for a summer camp and I always had kids all of the same age. But let's talk about them. So there's Ripley. She's the youngest one, and she's super excitable. She's that kid who's like always exclaiming. If it was a cartoon, she'd be the one who gets stars in her eyes. I mean, it is kind of a cartoon, and she does get stars in her eyes, but she's also full of empathy and love, and she's super, super adventurous. This is April. She might be our favorite one in this house. April is like a miniature superhero powerhouse. She's also a little bit obsessive. She's like preternaturally strong, stronger than any just normal kid ought to be in this world. And she also is completely obsessed with doing things the right way and like embarking on her own adventure whenever she thinks something needs fixing. She wants all of the badges. She doesn't want anybody to be sad. She thinks she can kind of fix and control everything. Then we have the tallest girl here, Jo. Jo is like a super brain scientist, and she's a little bit more reserved, but she's been best friends with April for the longest time, and so they know each other outside of camp. Then we have Molly down here. Molly's like a little bit on the shyer side, and she thinks she really loves it at camp, but she doesn't really know what her place in the world, I think, is outside of camp. Molly is very good at archery, and she also has some other talents, some of which I think sometimes are kind of empathy-related talents, much like Ripley. And then finally on the end we have Mal here. Mal's the cool punk. Look at her cool shaved side head. She's in a band outside of camp, but she decided rather than go to band camp, she was going to come to this camp. Mal does not always like all the outdoor stuff, and she especially does not like water, but she also finds herself in all of these adventures, and a lot of times is the one who like has that moment of bravery that says, we're gonna do it this way. So part of what I love about this cast of characters is they all have such distinct personality types, and they get combined as the series goes on in different twosomes for different adventures or just different scenes. And each twosome kind of creates a very different kind of story, almost like they're like a little 5-point arc and you're drawing, or 5 points on a star and you're like drawing connections between different ones, and depending on who you get different story outcomes. So like Ripley plus Joe, which is a really fun one, tends to be like really adventurous, try anything, and but also very inventive, because you got the most adventurous one and then the sciencey one. Whereas like April and Mal together tend to really, turn into crazy plans. Oh, that's the other thing about Mal. She loves making crazy plans. So these are characters that I feel like I live with, partially because my little kid, who's been reading this since I guess she was 3, maybe a little bit before she was 3, now that I think about it, and she's now 4.5, and she knows all these characters by name. She reads these books, actually reads them. She used to just have them memorized, but now she'll sit and read them. And she will just walk around and say, oh, we're with the Lumberjanes. Look, Molly's here with me holding my hand, and so is April. Like, even if we're not in a hike, we could just be at the grocery store and the Lumberjanes are with us. So clearly the series is charming, but I did not think so. When I first got this volume, I got it because it was like by female creators, by Noelle Stevenson is the creator. It has a all-girl cast, and that's the kind of book that I like to support and also just like to like. And I read it, and I was just like, this is not for me. I got maybe 2 issues in, and I had this reaction that I get sometimes when something is critically praised, where I was like, this is crap! And I was just done with it. But it had been sitting around in my house, and as my daughter got older and she, and it made more sense to read her longer books and longer comic books, I got it back out because I thought, well, there's a lot of girls on the page, and I was starting to see that representation really mattered to her. Like, she would sit for any comic book, but if there was a comic book like Spider-Gwen or Captain Marvel or Wonder Woman that had a lot of female characters on the page, I just noticed that her attention would be held much, much longer. She liked the stories from the other books just as much, but she just would like be riveted by seeing people who ostensibly looked like her. She started to get used to her own image in the mirror on the page. So I was like, wow, Lumberjanes could be a hit. And here's what I discovered about Lumberjanes. It's actually not just a hit for kids, but there's something about reading it out loud and giving specific voices to these characters that made it so much better. When I first read it, there's just a lot of yelling. This is like a great example of an early page. There's all of this exclaiming. It just feels like everybody's at the top of their lungs. Holly Mae Jameson, everyone head to the store, it's too dangerous. Ah, it's no use, we're climbing current. Yeah, we are. I said that from the shore. Like, it just feels like this whole entire page is yelling. It's just lots of yelling. And I felt like that was the whole book. It just seemed like short attention span theater when I was reading it by myself. But in giving the characters voices for my daughter as I was reading it, I started to like understand the differences between the characters a little bit more, and that yes, they do a lot of yelling, but we're starting to figure out like how those personalities differ. So I'm almost to the spoilers part, I think. So in these first 2 volumes, this is what the original series was going to be, just 8 issues. And so we get kind of like the disconnected 4 random kind of monstery adventures here in this first volume that doesn't really explain what's happening in this world. And then in the second volume, it kind of all coheres together into an overarching story of like what is going on and why are all of these weird creatures around. And it starts out with, I think, like the first best issue of the series, issue 5, which is an issue where the girls make friendship bracelets. And there's actually instructions to make friendship bracelets in it, which we did. And then also their camp is invaded by magical dinosaurs. There's the friendship bracelet instructions. And that really starts a series of really fun, hilarious adventures, including a really cool game of Capture the Flag that gets to the point of what was happening in the camp in terms of the first arc. So now I'm going to go into spoiler territory, although I'll say 2 things before I do that. So one is that I don't know that spoilers can really ruin the series. There's a couple of big turns, and that's part of what makes me actually love it now as an adult reader, is that it's a kid's series that actually has an overarching plot. Like, things happen, things get revealed, there's moments you're like, oh my gosh, if I had known that earlier, I would have understood this differently. So there are spoilers, but I don't think they ruin the book. But the other thing is that Lumberjanes is very weirdly behind its publishing schedule in terms of releasing collected editions. So I have the first 5 here. We have 2 more, which are, you know, upstairs somewhere, probably in her bed with her, sleeping, because she loves them. But, and the 8th one comes out in just a couple weeks, or has just come out. But they're always 4 issues each. So with 8 collections, we're only up to issue 32, except for in publishing, Lumberjanes is about to hit the 50 issue mark. So how do we get that 18 issue deficit in collected editions? Well, I think they know that they have a good thing going, and so they've been very measured, you might say even glacial, in releasing the collected editions of Lumberjanes. It seems like this year it's starting to catch up a little bit, which makes me wonder, is the end in sight, or are they starting to come up on like a big media tie-in? I know it's been options for some kind of film or cartoon. That makes them want to have more books out on the market. But that means I can't spoil you too much, because I am still like 2 years behind on reading Lumberjanes, because we only read this in collected editions. I'm just afraid of what would happen if I revealed that I could get like digital ones updated all the time. My daughter would be like, is there a new Lumberjanes? Is there new Lumberjanes? Constantly. She's still trying to understand the concept of like monthly comic books. It's actually really hilarious. Like, we'll read a series that's coming out regularly, and she'll say, well, where's the next one? I'm like, well, they haven't drawn it yet. She's like, can you please tell them they need to draw it? I want to read the next issue. So now we're going to go into spoiler territory, where I can talk a little bit more in depth about the plot and why I've become such a big fan of this series. Okay, so here we go for the spoiler territory for Lumberjanes. So in these first 2 volumes, it turns out that the thing that's happening at the camp is the camp has become a sort of game board, in a way, for a series of Greek gods incarnate on the earth. Now, this is not Wonder Woman. It's not a series that like super deep goes into Greek mythology, but Artemis is one of the gods who's also known as Diana, so fun for little kids who like Wonder Woman. And she is basically hedging her bet against her brother Apollo by infiltrating this girls' camp while Apollo infiltrates the boys' camp, and they're kind of pitting them against each other because they're playing for special powers from their father Zeus, right? So this all plays out, and the Lumberjanes effectively thwart their plan and also save the boys' camp in the process of thwarting the gods' plan, and kind of make sure that like neither of them gets the gods of use. Ripley famously gets in the way of the power transfer, and she kind of has like a Dark Phoenix moment, which is actually part of the greatness of this book. Like, there's so many nods to other comic books, and like they do yell fastball special all the time, which my daughter loves, and I keep trying to explain to her that it's Wolverine and Colossus who originated the fastball special. And then Ripley like briefly goes Dark Phoenix, but then she just decides that she's going to use all of her infinite power to just make infinite kittens, which then just live at the camp. So it's a silly book. But the thing that gets really interesting, so I read these first 2, and I was like, I loved the second one. The second one like really characterized for me why this series was so great. But I was like, well, where could this possibly go from here? Like, what are they going to do? Is it always going to be these like Greek god problems? Because it seems like that's over. So then in the 3rd collection, they really kind of get far afield from those problems, and they focus on some smaller stories within the camp, but they also start to develop the greater question about what is going on at this camp. Not everything was related to the gods. Some of the things that popped up in the beginning, like the dinosaurs, are coming from this like weird alternate dimension that's connected to the camp, that things get time lost in that direction. And it turns out that the camp director, Rosie, who's a character I adore and I love doing her voice because I give her a fun little accent, definitely understands that there's something weird going on at this camp, but she never just comes out and says, like, campers, we're at supernatural camp. Like, she's always trying to keep it contained and not reveal all the information. And then there's also this old lady who used to be the head counselor of the camp, but now she's some kind of werebear. And so she's always turning up, sometimes as an old lady, sometimes as a bear, and she has access to this alternate dimension that has all the time stuff in it. And so you start to realize that there's like a much deeper, broader story of like, what is this camp? Why is it at the center of all of this stuff? And in the course of this 3rd volume, we also get something really interesting that made me love this series even more. We realize that there starts to be a little bit of a love relationship between Molly and Mal. Now, the part of what I love about Lumberjanes is that they're such unfiltered lovable kids, and they don't bring a lot of outside worries into the kid space. Like, they don't, I mean, there's a little bit of talk about like some of the older ones thinking about college and things, but they're not concerned with a lot of like real world problems. They're very much just concerned about each other in camp, and that's what makes it such a fun book to read with a kid. But relationships and love and self-identity are part of that. And in the third volume, some of those themes, which only got a little tickled in the initial volume, start to come to the fore. So one is that Molly and Mal definitely have feelings for each other. There's no scene where they're like, we might be lesbians. Like, it's never as outright as that. They are together and they're having a fun day, and they start referring to it as a date, and there's clearly like a little bit of tension between them. It's totally kid appropriate. There's nothing about it that I wouldn't read to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, but it's just right there on the page. There's also a hint that Jo potentially is actually a trans girl. They never come right out and say it, and Molly's known her forever, and Molly never comes out and says like, hey, I remember when you had a boy body. But there's a lot of hints that like she feels out of place and there's a big change in her life. We later find out that she's actually the adopted daughter of two dads who are together. So there's definitely an awesome theme of LGBT love in this series and representation on the page, which I just felt great about. Like, I had no idea that that's what I was buying to read to my kid. And you, if you've been watching this channel, you know I absolutely want my child to be surrounded by that, especially now that we're in Wellington. I don't have my friend network that I had in the States, which had amazing people in our lives that are from that community. And so I'm like, how do I show my child love for the LGBT community and acceptance for that community without having my friends with me that are of that community? And part of the way is to show representation. So it made me so happy when we got to that third one and we got to that. But the one that really sealed it, I mean, I know I keep saying this, so I didn't like the first volume. The second volume, I was like, oh, there's something to this. The third volume made me say, wow, this book is doing a lot more than being a kid's book. But then the fourth volume for me is really the one that brought it together. It's called Out of Time. And this is one big story, and it's about the girls are kind of on a hike, they get separated in the snow, and their counselor, Jen, who's not always up on all of the supernatural hijinks, but she kind of understands what's going on, and she wanted to go to NASA camp, so this is a big departure for her. And she's always like, oh, I could be learning about rockets right now. She gets separated, and she meets a former camper who has made it her mission to hunt down all of these fantastical creatures. And it creates a really interesting moral quandary for these campers of like, are they here to protect the forest, or are they here to protect themselves from the forest? It's really tense, and it's like a big emotional plot. It does have some violence and some guns in it, not in a graphic way, but in a way that I had to filter a little bit for my kid and explain, like, she's got guns because she's a hunter. It might not be good that she's a hunter. We have to decide for ourselves from the plot. And the thing that we find out in this one that really like blows the whole thing open is that there's something timey-wimey and strange going on with the Lumberjanes camp, because Jo calls into her dad's on a special satellite phone, and they don't think as much time has passed as she does. She feels like they've been there for weeks and weeks, and they just think that she's been there for a few days. So is this Lumberjanes camp like unstuck in time? What is going on? Why are the Lumberjanes having all these crazy monster experiences, and can they ever leave? So things really get interesting from there. But also I think after that, the book realizes it needs to slow down a little bit if it's going to sustain its popularity and its story. So not every story winds up being about this kind of like core Lumberjanes, what's going on at the camp, which I think all four of the first volumes are about. So then volume 5 actually winds up being this really charming one-off story about mermaids that live in the lake outside of the camp. And it's a great April story, and we love April. So that was really satisfying. Also, the girls on the cover here are much more on the model of what they look like on the inside of the book. This cover of number 1, this is more in Noelle Stevenson's vibe, and she's the illustrator of Nimona as well, creator and illustrator, and with these kind of like super angular faces. But if you look at them compared to this one, especially April, the kids just look much more like that on the inside of the book. The artists do change, but this is, I think this one is like this is actually not a great panel of them, but I think it shows them on model and shows that they're like much rounder than they are in that initial cover. So there's also volume 6 and 7, and I'm not going to recap every volume, but there's definitely this sense that like now we're in this ongoing kind of saga of Lumberjanes, and it's fine to do sideline stories because we still find out a little bit more about this main Lumberjanes world as we're going on these side stories. So the girls help their counselor look into some mischievous selkies, which are were-seals, more or less. And then what happens in the one that comes after that? Oh, so the elders of the camp visit to evaluate the camp, but they get kidnapped by a giant rock, which is like a big bird, like a giant bird, and so the girls have to go and save them. So things keep developing, and the final theme that comes out is a theme that was really close to my own heart and let me have great conversations with my daughter, which is that one of the boys that the girls meet at the boys' camp, Barney, just does not feel like he belongs at the boys' camp. They never come right out and say that he's gay or that he's trans, but he just doesn't feel like he's accepted there, and every time he's with the girls, he feels like he feels at home. And that was me as a kid. I did not understand what it was like to be in all-male spaces. I didn't think it was for me. I didn't connect with other boys. I got sent to camp, not an overnight camp, but like a day camp, and I just was in misery every day because it was gender divided, and I had to spend the whole day with like 15 other boys. I'm like, this is hell. So then if you looked at my friend group at any given time, it was like 90% girls. I just never fit in with other guys. So I really like totally feel for Barney, and I did not expect that I was going to get into this series and like find me on the page, but he's me. It's crazy. And so he wants to be at the Lumberjanes camp. But if you recall in this initial issue, when I read you the plaque that hangs above the camp, it's for hardcore lady types. So is Barney a hardcore lady type? Like, should he have to identify as a woman in order to be with the people that understand him the most? And that plot finally, it's been threaded for a while. It kind of starts out in volume 4, and in volume 7, Barney finally gets his moment, and it was just like so incredibly touching to me, because it really reminded me of my own life. So there's so much in these books. They're genius. They're wonderful. They're adorable. They're heart-filled. If I had to make a critique of them, I do think it devolves into yelling a lot, although they do tend to yell out names of famous feminist figures, so that's pretty cool, but it is a lot of yelling at points. I think sometimes there's like a couple of language concepts that I'm like, why do we need to introduce this? Like they say like freaking all the time, and they talk about things being like crap, or I don't know. I have like this weird barometer for kids books where I think a lot of thematic stuff clearly is really appropriate for little kids, but I'm like, why would you introduce these language or habits or whatever to a kid if you could avoid that? So I'm much more about restricting those kind of things. Like, we don't say stupid when we're reading books unless it's like plot specific. If somebody's like, this is stupid, or I think she's stupid, we just substitute the word silly. So that's an example of what my house is like. So there's like a couple little moments like that in these books, but really there's just nothing that I would restrict. And then the gun stuff in volume 4 I had to really characterize. Now, of course, I've been having this whole conversation with you as somebody who's reading these books to a now 4.5-year-old kid who now reads them to herself. She learned to read from Lumberjanes. But would I recommend these books to you if you don't have a kid to read them with? Well, I think that you might have a little bit of trouble getting through that first volume if you're not reading it aloud with a little kid who sees some wonder in it. But if you're somebody who likes books about like young kids and their silly adventures, if you're somebody who yearns for being able to go back and experience things like The Goonies again for the first time, I think that these books could still hold some wonder for you, especially because as they go on, you realize there is a longer term plot here, and it's fascinating. And I think that that's like something that we as comic readers love, like a book that can do serialized, cute, funny stories, but that have a longer game. And so that's part of why I love Lumberjanes. I look forward to it, and I resist reading it as soon as it comes out of the mail. We make a special appointment, sit on the couch, and read it issue by issue whenever there is a new one. And there's many more to come because of how behind the series is in getting collected and collected editions. So that is Lumberjanes. It has my unequivocal endorsement for giving as a gift to young kids, whether or not they're into comics already or not, these volumes. And they're pretty well made. I mean, this is probably the most beat up you'll ever see a book in my house be, because it's being handled by a 4-year-old who reads it constantly. But if you look at it, it's actually an indicator of how well made it is. This book has stitching. Like, it's a glued book, but there are stitched, can you see that? they're stitched signatures. And so even as it's falling apart a little, it's not like single pages are just coming out of the book, because it's actually a nice binding. You can see it here as this whole stitch is starting to come out. Can you see that? So it's easy to just glue them back down because it's a well-made book. So it's like even more reason. There are oversized hardcover versions of Lumberjanes. I probably will buy them eventually to have like nice ones on my shelf. They collect 2 of these books each, but I'm not going to give those to a little kid who just throws them in their book bag all the time. So that is Lumberjanes. It is one of my favorite independent series. I highly, highly recommend sampling it. I highly recommend giving it to kids in your life of any age, older than, let's say, 2, because that's probably when we started reading it here in this household. So thank you so much for tuning into this indie series spotlight. I have so many indie books. They start here and they go across this whole shelf and then all the way across the shelf on the bottom here too, and they're stacked double deep down there. So I probably have almost like this many indie books that are on the shelf here, and which is not even counting my 90s Wildstorm collection, which wouldn't even fit on these shelves. So my point being, I have so many more that I can talk about, but I'm only going to keep talking about them if I know that people want to be seeing videos like this one. So I want you to tell me, A, do you want more indie series spotlight, but B, like, how could I be doing this better for you? Should I show more interior art? Should I go deeper into spoilers? What is going to help you be convinced by me that you should read this book or not, or at least to know, like, hey, this one sounds cool, but it's not for me. That is a fine outcome of this as well. So please sound off in the comments below. I love hearing from you. I love talking to you, and I would love to continue to bring you more of my favorite indie series in this indie series spotlight. So this has been a spotlight on Lumberjanes. Thank you so much for watching.